There is a silence that lives inside government buildings after 5 o'clock. Not the absence of sound. Something heavier. The hum of fluorescent tubes cooling. The tick of a wall clock no one remembers winding. The particular stillness of hallways where people once argued over drainage easements and setback variances. Now emptied of every voice. I know that silence well. For 11 months, I worked inside it, 2 floors above a room that, according to every public directory in Hargrove County, does not exist. I am going to tell you about that room. I am going to tell you what I found inside it. And I am going to tell you about the 31 properties in this county whose permits contain rules that no building code on earth could explain. Before I begin, I want to say something. If you're here, listening in the dark, letting this voice carry you towards sleep or simply keep you company on a quiet night, you are part of what makes Grim Masquerade possible. This channel exists because you choose to return. If you'd like to help it continue, if these stories have earned a place in your evenings, there is a link in the description where you can offer your support. It is never expected. It is always noticed. Thank you. Now, let me take you back to Breslin. Breslin is the kind of town where the post office closes for lunch and nobody complains. The county seat of Hargrove County, Southeast Ohio, population just under 9,000 if you count the census tracts generously. I moved there in February for the job. 23 years old, 6 months removed from a community college certificate in public administration, and exactly desperate enough to accept a Clerk 2 position in the Hargrove County Office of Land Use and Development at $31,000 a year. The listing described the role as processing residential and commercial permit applications, maintaining digital and physical records, and assisting the public with zoning inquiries. It sounded like paper. Harmless, tedious, ordinary paper. The office occupied the 2nd floor of the Hargrove County Courthouse, a limestone building from 1937, with radiators that clanked like someone was trapped inside them every time the heat cycled on. The marble stairs leading up from the lobby had a shallow groove worn into each step from decades of foot traffic, and the banister was brass that had been polished so many times it felt almost soft under your palm. My desk sat near the window overlooking Main Street. In the mornings, if I arrived early enough, I could hear the bakery truck making its delivery 2 buildings down, the rattle of its diesel engine, the clatter of sheet pans being unloaded onto a dolly, mixing with the sound of our copier warming up, that low electric whine that meant someone had beaten me in. There were 4 of us in the office. Janet Keeler ran the front counter and had a gift for deflecting angry contractors with a kind of lethal politeness that I found both impressive and slightly frightening. Tom Brannick handled commercial permits and spoke almost exclusively about his base boat, a 17-foot aluminum thing he kept on a trailer behind his duplex and launched every weekend from April to October, regardless of weather or whether the fish were biting. Donna Adwell, the senior clerk, had been there 19 years longer than any other employee in the building, except the class custodian. She kept a small ceramic cardinal on her monitor and a laminated prayer card in her top drawer, and she knew the location of every file in the office the way some people know the rooms of a childhood home. She could be standing at the copier, back turned, and tell you which cabinet the Ridgeway subdivision plats were in without pausing her conversation. There was supposed to be a 5th person. Phil Oster, whose desk sat across from mine, had gone on medical leave 2 weeks before I started. His desk was clean. No photos, no coffee mug ring, no personality left behind. Just a county-issued keyboard and a monitor in sleep mode, its small green light pulsing like a heartbeat in an empty chest. Nobody said much about him. Tom mentioned once, in passing, that Phil had been working on some of the older property files before he left, and Donna changed the subject with a smoothness that I registered, but did not, at the time, understand. She asked Tom about his boat, and Tom, being Tom, obliged, and the moment dissolved into something about a trolling motor. My days developed a rhythm quickly, the way all government work does. Not because the tasks demanded it, but because without rhythm, the hours would simply pool and stagnate. Arrive at 8. Hang my jacket on the hook behind my chair. Coffee from the pot Donna brewed in the kitchenette, always slightly too strong, always half-gone by the time I reached it, always poured into the same tan mug I had claimed my first week by writing my initials on the bottom in permanent marker. Log in. Clear the overnight digital submissions. Mostly residential additions, fence permits, the occasional commercial renovation request from someone optimistic enough to open a business in Breslin. Pull physical files when digital records were incomplete, which was often. The county's digitization project had stalled in 2019 due to budget cuts, and roughly a third of our older records existed only on paper, stored in filing cabinets on our floor or in cardboard banker's boxes in the basement. Lunch at noon, usually a sandwich from the deli on Crandall Street. Turkey and Swiss, the bread always a little too thick, eaten at my desk while I scrolled through news on my phone with one hand and caught crumbs with the other. Afternoons were walk-ins and phone calls. By 4:30, the office was quiet, and by 5, I was locking the front door and descending the wide marble staircase to the lobby, my footsteps echoing off the limestone in that particular way that made even a single person sound like a procession leaving a cathedral. I liked the work, if I am being honest. There is something calming about bureaucracy when it functions as intended. Forms have boxes. Boxes require information. Information either fits or it does not. For 3 months, I lived entirely inside that logic, and it felt like enough. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in late October. I took a call just after 2 in the afternoon. The office was quiet. Tom had stepped out for an inspection. Janet was restocking the supply closet, and Donna was on her direct line in the hallway, her voice a low murmur I could not decipher through the closed door. The caller was a woman, older, her voice carrying that careful politeness people in the county used when they suspected they were about to be transferred or told to call back. She said she owned a property on Tabernacle Road and needed to confirm the status of her permit. I asked for the address. She gave it, 1142 Tabernacle Road. I typed it into our system, one finger hovering over the enter key for a moment before I pressed it. The screen returned a result I had never seen before. The property appeared, a parcel number 2281T, owner name matching, but where the permit history should have been, where there should have been a list of dates and types and statuses, there was only a single line, CRP active. Refer to lower division. I stared at it. The cursor blinked. In 3 months of daily searches, I had never encountered the abbreviation CRP. Our permits were categorized as residential, commercial, agricultural, or conditional use. CU, not CRP, and lower division was not a term that appeared in our employee handbook, our internal directory, or any conversation I had ever heard in the office. I told the woman I would need to look into it and call her back. She paused, a pause that lasted 1 beat too long, a pause that had weight to it, the weight of recognition. Then she said, very quietly, "They always say that. She left her number. I wrote it on a yellow sticky note and pressed it to the edge of my monitor, where it stayed, curling slightly in the dry radiator heat for the rest of the week. I asked Donna about it that afternoon. I kept my voice casual, the way you do when you are testing a surface and not yet sure of its strength. Hey, I got a weird one. Property on Tabernacle Road flagged as CRP, with a referral to something called Lower Division. Is that an old code? Donna did not look up from her screen immediately. Her fingers paused on the keyboard for perhaps 1 second, a hesitation so brief that anyone else would have missed it. But I was watching the sum because something about the call had made me watch everything more carefully. Then she said, some of the older parcels have legacy codes from before the system conversion. If it says to refer somewhere, it probably just means the physical file is in the basement. I wouldn't worry about it. She went back to typing. The ceramic cardinal watched me from the top of her monitor with its painted black eye. I nodded, returned to my desk, and let the afternoon pass in its usual rhythm of keystrokes and phone calls and the muffled sounds of the building around me. But I did not stop thinking about it. That night, in my apartment above the hardware store on Elm, I lay in bed listening to the wind push against the old window glass, and I thought about the word always in the woman's voice. They always say that, not they usually or they might. Always, as if she had made this call before, as if she expected, with the certainty of long experience, the answer I gave her. The basement of the Hargrove County Courthouse was not a single open space, but a network of rooms branching off a central corridor with a poured concrete floor and exposed pipes overhead that sweated in the summer and groaned in the winter. Most of it was used for storage. Bankers' boxes of old tax records stacked on metal shelving, decommissioned, office furniture draped in plastic sheeting, holiday decorations for the lobby. Christmas trees sealed in bins with masking tape labels, in handwriting that had faded to ghosts. The lights were on a pull chain system, each one casting a yellow circle that barely reached the next, so that walking the corridor meant passing through alternating pools of dim light and near darkness. I had been down there twice before, both times to retrieve zoning files from the 1990s, and both times I had stayed in the first storage room near the stairs, working quickly, eager to return to the fluorescent normalcy of the second floor. The door, marked records, restricted, was at the far end of the corridor, past the boiler room, past a janitorial closet that smelled of bleach and wet concrete. I had noticed it on my second visit, but assumed it led to another storage area. Perhaps one requiring clearance I did not have. It was a steel door, painted the same institutional gray as the walls, with a keypad lock and a small placard that read 002. 2 days after the Tabernacle Road call, I went down during my lunch break. I brought my sandwich with me, unwrapped but uneaten, as a kind of alibi. Just eating my lunch, just looking for a file. Nothing purposeful, nothing unusual. The corridor was cold, noticeably colder than the floors above. The kind of cold that seeped through shoe leather and settled into the small bones of your feet, and did not leave. The pull chain lights swayed slightly in some imperceptible draft, their circles of light shifting like slow, uncertain searchlights. I walked past the storage rooms, past the boiler's low mechanical groan, until I reached the gray door. I tried the handle, locked. The keypad glowed faintly green, waiting for input with the patience of a thing that had nowhere else to be. I went back upstairs and finished the day, my sandwich eaten cold at my desk, the bread staler than usual. That evening, I checked the county's internal portal for any reference to rooms 002, Lower Division, or CRP. Nothing. I checked the building directory posted in the lobby. A framed document behind glass, updated annually in January. Nothing. I searched the county's public website, clicking through every department and sub-office listed, reading descriptions of functions I had never thought about. The Soil and Water Conservation District, the Dog Warden, the Board of Developmental Disabilities. The Office of Land Use and Development had no division described as lower. The courthouse basement was listed only as building services and archival storage. For a week I let it sit. Or I tried to, not. I processed permits. I answered the phone. I ate my sandwich. I listened to Tom describe a largemouth bass that was growing in size with each retelling. I watched Donna take her hallway calls. But the sticky note, with the Tabernacle Road woman's number, stayed on my monitor, and every morning, when I sat down with my too-strong coffee, I saw it. The yellow was beginning to fade where the sun touched it. The following Monday, I arrived early, 7:30, before anyone else. The building was unlocked. Mr. Dorsey, the custodian, started at 6. I could hear him somewhere above me, the distant thump of a mop bucket against a doorframe. I went downstairs. The corridor was silent, except for the boiler. The pull-chain lights felt dimmer in the early morning, or perhaps that was simply the absence of the building's daytime hum to give them context. I walked to the gray door and stood in front of it, and then, for reasons I cannot fully explain except that I had been thinking about it for 8 days, and the thinking had become a kind of pressure, I tried the most common default code for county-issued keypads, the last 4 digits of the building's street address. 0471. The lock clicked. The small light turned from green to amber. I pushed the door open. The room beyond was not a storage closet. It was an office, small, perhaps 12 by 14 feet, with a low ceiling and no windows, which made sense for a basement but contributed to a feeling of compression, of being held inside something that had been deliberately sealed. Against the far wall sat a metal desk, old but well-maintained, its surface clear except for a green-shaded banker's lamp and a rotary telephone. The phone was black, heavy, the kind with a fabric cord that coiled twice before reaching the wall jack. To the left of the desk stood a filing cabinet, 4 drawers, painted a dark military green that had faded with decades to the color of dried moss. To the right, a wooden shelf held a row of identical leather-bound logbooks, their spines unmarked except for date ranges, stamped in gold leaf that had gone dull with age. The desk was not dusty. That was the first thing I understood, and it mattered more than anything else in the room. Dust accumulates in unused spaces with the inevitability of gravity. This desk had been wiped down recently. The lamp worked. I pulled the chain and it clicked on, filling the room with a warm yellow glow that made the concrete walls look almost amber, almost inviting, in a way that felt like a lie. There was a date stamp on the desk, the kind you advance by hand with a small lever. It was set to the previous Friday's date. Someone was using this office. Someone had been here 2 days ago. I should have left. I want to be clear about that, because what comes next might sound like the behavior of someone reckless or foolhardy, and I need you to know that I understood the risk. I was in a room I had no authorization to enter, and the date stamp meant someone maintained this space actively. But I also knew that our office had no record of this room, no personnel assigned to it, and no explanation for what CRP meant, or why a property on Tabernacle Road had been flagged with a code that did not exist in our system. Curiosity is not courage. Curiosity is just the inability to stop a question once it has started moving. I went to the logbook shelf first. The date ranges on the spines, began in 1951 and continued, volume by volume, to the present year. I pulled the most recent one and opened it on the desk beneath the green light. The entries were handwritten in blue ink, each one following the same format: a date, a parcel number, an address, and a brief notation. The handwriting was steady and old-fashioned, the letters formed with a deliberate, almost calligraphic care that I associated with people who had learned to write before ballpoint pens were common. I turned the pages slowly, scanning. November 8, parcel 2281T, 1142 Tabernacle Road. CRP renewed. Conditions in margin. Quarterly compliance report received. No incidents. There it was. The same parcel, the same address, the same code. I looked at the margin, written in smaller script, slightly different ink. Occupancy limited to months March through October. November through February. Property sealed per original agreement. Resident notified. County assumes no liability for consequences arising from non-compliance. I read it 3 times. Occupancy limited to months, not hours of construction noise, not types of building material, months during which a person could live in their own home. And the phrase is at the end. County assumes no liability for consequences arising from non-compliance, not fines, not liens, not penalties, consequences. A word that carried the weight of something physical, something that happened to bodies and to minds, not to paperwork. I turned more pages. Each entry followed the pattern, and each set of conditions was different but equally dislocated from any building code I had ever studied. Parcel 3360L, 27 Lockmore Hollow. CRP initial issue. Conditions: no more than 2 occupants at any time. No audio recording devices on property. Between sunset and sunrise, all windows on the north face to remain covered. Compliance monitored quarterly. Parcel 0044B, Corwin Farm, Route 9. CRP renewed. Conditions: livestock limited to species pre-approved by the lower division. No excavation below 4 feet without written authorization. Any unusual animal behavior to be reported within 24 hours. The county assumes no liability for consequences arising from non-compliance. I kept turning pages. The entries stretched back months, then years. The earlier logbooks on the shelf would take them back decades. Entry referenced the lower division. Every entry used the term CRP. Canonical residency permit, I now understood, though it was never once spelled out. As though the full name were something you earned, rather than something you were told. And every entry ended with that same liability clause, repeated with the precision of a prayer or a ward, as if the county wrote it, not because it protected anyone, but because the act of writing it made the unwritable somehow containable. I opened the filing cabinet. The top drawer held folders organized by parcel number, each one thick with documents. The original CRP issuance, renewal forms, compliance reports, and in some cases correspondence on county letterhead. I pulled the folder for parcel 2281T, Tabernacle Road. The original permit was dated June 1953. The paper was heavy, slightly yellowed at the edges, with the county seal embossed in the upper left corner. The language was formal but plain, the prose of an institution that had learned to say terrifying things in the most ordinary way possible. It stated that the property at 1142 Tabernacle Road was subject to a conditional residency permit under the authority of the Hargrove County Lower Division, and that continued occupancy was contingent upon adherence to the conditions enumerated below. The conditions matched the logbook margin notes. Seasonal occupancy restrictions, reporting requirements for any unusual sensory phenomena experienced on the property, and the prohibition of alterations to the foundation or cellar. Without prior written approval, the permit had been renewed every 5 years since 1953. The most recent renewal bore the current year's date. I sat in the green-shaded lamplight and felt the weight of what I was holding. This was not an old curiosity, not a forgotten relic of some previous era's misguided policy. This was an active system. Someone in this building. Someone who came to this basement office, who advanced that date stamped by hand, who answered that rotary phone if it rang, was administering permits that governed not construction, not land use in any conventional sense, but the terms under which people were allowed to exist on their own property. And the system had been running, unbroken and unquestioned, for over 70 years. I photographed several pages with my phone, the flash too bright in the small room. Each shutter sounded unnervingly loud. Then, I returned the logbook and the folder to their exact positions, turned off the lamp, and left. The keypad locked behind me with a small, definitive click. I walked up the stairs into the ordinary fluorescent world of the second floor, where Tom was on the phone, and Janet was explaining setback requirements to a man in a Carhartt jacket, and I sat down at my desk and stared at the yellow sticky note on my monitor, and tried to reconcile what I had just seen with the world I was sitting in. They did not reconcile. Over the next 2 weeks, I returned to the basement office 4 more times, always during lunch, when the building's rhythms provided the most reliable cover, always alone. I was methodical about it. I brought a legal pad. I wore a watch so I could track my time without checking my phone. And I kept each visit to exactly 30 minutes. I worked through the filing cabinet, drawer by drawer, photographing documents, cross-referencing parcel numbers with our public system upstairs. The pattern was airtight. Every CRP parcel appeared in our database with the same cryptic flag, CRP active, refer to lower division, and no additional information. To anyone searching from the second floor, these properties were black holes in the record, present on the map, opaque in every other way. I compiled what I found. There were 31 active CRP properties in Hargrove County, 31 parcels with conditions that no zoning board had ever debated, no planning commission had ever reviewed, no public hearing had ever disclosed. Some conditions were almost comprehensible. Limits on occupancy, restrictions on excavation, things that, if you squinted, could pass for environmental precautions. But others were not. The file for 3187 Dullahan Pike belonged to a man named Gerald Mathers. His CRP had been issued in 1974 and renewed 11 times. The conditions were among the most detailed I found. No mirror or reflective surface exceeding 4 square inches was permitted anywhere on the property. Between 2 a.m. and 4:15 a.m., no resident was to be present on the ground floor. If knocking occurred at any exterior door during those hours, no response was to be given, not a word, not a movement toward the door, nothing. All incidents were to be logged in a journal kept on site and submitted quarterly to the lower division. The cellar was to be sealed, physically sealed, with materials specified in an addendum, from September 1 through May 31. And the familiar refrain, the county assumes no liability for consequences arising from non-compliance. I read Gerald Mathers's compliance reports, one after another, spanning decades. They were filled out on a county form I had never seen in our supply closet upstairs, printed on slightly heavier paper than our standard stock, with lower division, printed in small type at the bottom, where our forms read, Office of Land Use and Development. For 49 years, Gerald or his successors had filed these quarterly. The earlier ones were sparse, no incidents, conditions maintained. The handwriting was steady, the prose of someone performing a duty so familiar it had become automatic. But the later reports grew less spare. One from autumn 2003 read, "Knocking reported on 3 consecutive nights. Oct 12-14. No response per conditions. Duration increased from approx. 4 minutes to approx. 11 minutes on final night. Journal submitted under separate cover." Another from winter 2016. Resident reports persistent feeling of being observed from cellar access point, despite seal being intact. Seal inspected by lower division representative. No breach found. Resident advised to maintain conditions. No further action recommended. I sat with that 2016 report in the lamplight and felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not yet, but a kind of vertigo, the sensation you get when you look down from a height you did not realize you had climbed. These were not abstractions. These were people. People who had filed paperwork about knocking that lasted 11 minutes and grew longer each night. People who reported the feeling of being watched from behind a sealed door and were told, in official county language, to maintain conditions. The county had built an architecture, not of steel and concrete, but of forms and renewals and compliance deadlines, around experiences that should have been impossible, and that architecture had held for decades. It had outlasted administrations, recessions, wars. It had simply continued the way gravity continues, without needing anyone's permission. The file for 445 Burnt Mill Road was different from the others in a way that made me put my pen down and sit very still for a long time. The property was owned not by an individual, but by the Hargrove County Land Trust, which meant the county itself held the CRP. The county had issued a conditional residency permit to itself. The conditions were extensive and included language I had not encountered in other files. Maintain perimeter fencing to specifications outlined in Addendum C. Conduct monthly site inspections with no fewer than 2 personnel. No individual to enter structure without accompaniment. All monitoring equipment to remain active and calibrated. In the event of equipment failure, evacuate the parcel within 30 minutes and contact the lower division immediately. There was an addendum from 1991 that referenced an incident involving a county worker whose name had been redacted. Not with a black marker, the way you see in federal FOIA documents, but by careful excision. The paper itself had been cut away with a blade, leaving a small, precise rectangle of absence where the name had been. I held that page up to the green light. The cut was clean, deliberate, made with something very sharp. Someone had physically removed this person's name from the record, not obscured it, not classified it, removed it from the physical medium of paper itself, as though the county's machinery of documentation had decided that this person's connection to 44-5 Burnt Mill Road needed to be not merely hidden but unmade. It was after the Burnt Mill Road file that I pulled the oldest logbook from the shelf, the one dated 1951 to 1958, and opened it to the very first page. The handwriting was the same deliberate, slightly formal script that appeared in the most recent volume. For a disorienting moment, I thought I had made an error, pulled the wrong book, but the dates confirmed it. Entries from 1951, 1952, 1953, written in a hand identical to the one that had logged this year's CRP renewals. I placed the 2 books side by side on the desk and compared them under the lamp. The letter formations were identical. The spacing between words, the slant of the ascenders, the particular way the writer crossed their T's, with a slight upward stroke at the end. All of it matched. The ink had changed over the decades. Blue-black in the 1950s, a lighter blue in recent years, but the hand had not aged. Not even slightly. I closed both books and sat in the silence of that room and listened to the faint tick of the building above me settling into itself. And I understood that what I was reading was not simply a set of old files. I was reading a record kept by someone, or something, that had maintained identical handwriting for over 7 years. That is not possible. People's writing changes. It shifts with age, with injury, with the slow erosion of fine motor control that time exacts from everyone. This writing had not changed at all. Tucked inside the back cover of the 1951 logbook was a manila folder with a handwritten label. Origin, do not circulate. Inside were 7 pages of dense, careful script. The same hand on unlined paper. A narrative, not a form. The author identified himself as Harold Ennis, Special Permit Administrator, and the document was dated March 1953. Ennis described, in measured language that never once tipped into alarm, the circumstances that had led to the creation of the lower division. In 1949, he wrote, Hargrove County had begun receiving reports from residents of certain rural properties, reports of phenomena that did not correspond to any known structural, geological, or meteorological explanation. The reports varied in detail, but clustered geographically around specific parcels that shared no obvious characteristic except age. Some had been settled before Ohio statehood. Some had records stretching back to the original land grants of the late 18th century, when this part of the territory was still dense forest. And the nearest government authority was a territorial court 3 days' ride away. The county's initial response had been to send inspectors. 2 inspectors visited properties in the spring of 1950. One filed a report describing an unwillingness in the foundation of a home on what was then called Furnace Road, a phrase that belonged nowhere in any engineering manual, a phrase that sounded like something a person would say only when all technical language had failed. The other inspector did not file a report. Ennis noted, without elaboration, that this second inspector was unable to resume duties and has since relocated outside the county. A single sentence, no explanation, no follow-up. The kind of sentence that says more by what it refuses to contain. By 1951, the county had established the lower division as a sub-office of land use and development, reporting directly to the county administrator and exempt from public records requests under a provision of the county charter that I could not find referenced anywhere else. The purpose, Ennis wrote, was not to investigate the phenomena, but to manage them. Investigation implies the possibility of resolution, he wrote. What the county faces on these parcels does not resolve. It persists. It is older than the structures built upon it. It is older than the deeds that claim to define it. The appropriate response is not inquiry, but administration. That word, administration, the absolute faith in procedure as a response to the unknowable. He went on to describe the creation of the conditional residency permit as a legal instrument designed to accomplish 3 things simultaneously: allow continued habitation of affected properties, impose behavioral restrictions that appeared to reduce the frequency or severity of reported phenomena, and shield the county from liability. It was, he wrote, a negotiation conducted entirely through paperwork between an authority that requires order and a presence that predates the concept. Harold Ennis's final note, dated October 1971, was the last page in the Origin folder. It read, in part, I have administered this program for 20 years. I have seen conditions maintained and conditions violated. I have documented what compliance preserves and what non-compliance invites. I do not pretend to understand the nature of what exists on these parcels. I understand only that it is older than the county, older than the records, and entirely indifferent to our authority. The land does not care who files the paperwork, but the paperwork is all we have. I read that line in the basement, alone, and for the first time since I had started this job, I felt genuinely afraid, not of a sound, not of a shape in a doorway, not of anything I could point to and name. I was afraid of a system, afraid of the calm, competent machinery that had processed the incomprehensible into quarterly reports and filing deadlines and renewal forms, and had done so for longer than I had been alive, and would continue doing so long after I was gone. I was afraid of how well it worked, of how quiet it was, of how perfectly ordinary it looked from the outside. After that, I began to notice things upstairs that I had overlooked before. Small things that only mattered now because I had the context to make them matter. The way Donna occasionally received calls on her direct line and took them in the hallway, speaking too quietly to hear, her body angled away from the office so that even her posture conveyed privacy. The way certain property addresses, if mentioned in passing, produced a subtle shift in her demeanor, a straightening of the spine, a stillness in the hands, as if she were bracing against something before redirecting the conversation. The way our filing system had a gap. Cabinet 7, then Cabinet 9. There was no Cabinet 8. When I asked Tom about it, he shrugged and said it had been that way when he started. When I asked Janet, she said she assumed Cabinet 8 was in the basement somewhere. Neither of them seemed curious. Neither of them had looked. I looked. Cabinet 8 was in the basement office, bottom drawer. It contained the current year's compliance reports for all 31 active CRP properties, organized by parcel number. The folder was already half full. Someone was collecting these reports, reading them, filing them, and continuing the work that Harold Ennis had begun in 1951. Someone who used a rotary phone and a date stamp and kept a logbook in handwriting that did not age, working from a room that existed on no floor plan, in a division that appeared in no directory, administering permits for a purpose that no public meeting had ever discussed. It was after finding Cabinet 8 that I did something I should not have done. I called the Tabernacle Road woman back. It was a Thursday evening, just past 6. I sat in my apartment with the curtains drawn and the overhead light off, only the glow of the kitchen stove clock for company. I dialed from my personal phone. She answered on the second ring, as though she had been expecting someone to call. Though perhaps not me. I told her my name and that I was calling from the permits office about her earlier inquiry. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You found the room," and it was not a question. I asked about her CRP, about the conditions, about what it was like to live under rules she had not chosen and could not publicly contest. She was quiet again, longer this time. I could hear a clock ticking on her end. A real clock, mechanical, patient, measuring time in a way that digital clocks do not, with weight and consequence given to each second. Her name was Mrs. Pruitt. She and her husband had purchased the Tabernacle Road property in 1986. The CRP had been disclosed to them at closing, not by the realtor, not by the title company, but by a man from the county who visited them the day after they received the keys. He sat at their kitchen table, she said. He drank the coffee she offered. He explained the conditions in a calm, unhurried voice. He was polite, very polite. He told them the conditions were non-negotiable and that compliance was in their best interest, and that if they had questions, they could contact the lower division using a phone number he provided on a small white card. She still had the card. She kept it in her kitchen drawer behind the rubber bands and the dead batteries. And the takeout menus from a Chinese restaurant that had closed in 2004. I asked her if she had ever violated the conditions. She said no, not once, not in 37 years. I asked why, and I heard her take a breath I could feel across the phone line. Long, deliberate, the kind of breath a person takes before stepping off something solid. The 1st November, she said. We were still moving in. The man from the county hadn't come yet. That was in December. We didn't know about any of it. We stayed in the house past October because we didn't know we weren't supposed to. My husband woke up on November 4th at about 5 in the morning and came downstairs, and every piece of furniture in the living room was facing the wall. Not pushed, not thrown. Turned. Carefully, like someone had done it by hand, one piece at a time, in the dark, while we slept upstairs. The couch, the armchairs, the end tables, even a small bookshelf that must have weighed 80 pounds. Every piece. Facing the wall. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. Nothing was scratched. Just rearranged. With care, she paused. The clock ticked. We called the sheriff. He came out and looked and said it was probably a prank. But the doors were locked. The windows were locked from the inside. There was no sign of entry. And when the man from the county came the next month and explained the conditions, he didn't seem surprised when I told him. He wrote it down in a small book he carried, and he said, I remember this exactly because I have replayed it in my mind 1,000 times. He said, Mrs. Pruitt, the conditions are not protecting you from something. The conditions are maintaining an agreement. Your compliance is the protection. I wrote that sentence down on the back of an envelope. I have thought about it nearly every day since. The conditions are maintaining an agreement. Your compliance is the protection, not a wall between you and a threat. An agreement between the people who file the forms and the thing that does not need forms, does not read forms, but somehow, responds to whether the forms are followed. After Mrs. Pruitt, I could not maintain the pretense of ordinary work. I went to the basement every day. Sometimes during lunch, sometimes after 5, when the building emptied and the silence settled in and the only sounds were the boiler and my own breathing, and the small, deliberate noises of my hands turning pages. I worked through the compliance reports the way a historian reads letters from the dead, with attention to what was said, but more attention to what was left out. I found patterns. The eastern properties reported temperature anomalies most frequently. Rooms that grew cold in ways that had nothing to do with insulation or airflow. Southern parcels reported auditory phenomena, knocking, scratching, and voices described in the careful, measured language of people who had been trained by decades of quarterly forms. Not to use the word haunting. One resident at 20 Sentinel Moors described in a 2009 compliance report a sound like a child reciting numbers in a room I cannot locate. The western properties leaned toward visual disturbances. Shadows that moved against the direction of light, shapes in peripheral vision that dissolved when confronted, and, recurrently, the sense that the dimensions of rooms had shifted overnight. A hallway slightly longer, a ceiling slightly lower, though measurements confirmed no physical alteration. The northern properties, near the ridgeline, were different. Their reports were shorter. Not because nothing happened, but because the residents seemed to have less language for what they experienced, as though the phenomena there operated below the threshold of description. One compliance report from Dullahan Pike, filed in 2018, contained a single sentence. The cellar seal held. Another, from the same property in 2020. I heard my own voice from downstairs at 3:11 a.m. I did not respond. I read that line 3 times. The matter-of-fact notation, the restraint, the discipline of a person who hears their own voice calling from behind a sealed cellar door at 3 in the morning and does nothing. Because the form says to do nothing, and the form is the agreement, and the agreement is the only protection. It was during this period of daily visits that I found the file for parcel 1877R. This file was not in the main cabinet. It was in a separate drawer at the bottom of the desk, locked with a small brass key I found taped to the underside of the lamp's base, pressed flat against the metal with a strip of adhesive so old it had turned amber. The folder was thinner than the others, only a few pages, but the paper was older and heavier, and the county seal on the original document was hand-stamped rather than embossed, pressed into the paper with enough force to leave a faint impression on the page behind it. Parcel 1877R was located on Old Furnace Road. The CRP had been issued in 1951, the very first year of the program. The conditions were unlike anything else in the files. There were no occupancy restrictions because there was no occupancy permitted. The property was to remain permanently vacant. No structure was to be erected. No person was to enter the parcel boundaries between dusk and dawn under any circumstances. No person was to enter during daylight hours without written authorization from the lower division. The parcel was to be maintained in its current state in perpetuity or until such time as the lower division determines that conditions have fundamentally changed. There were no compliance reports because there were no residents to file them. Instead, the file contained inspection logs, monthly visits by the lower division administrator, each one a single line in that unchanging handwriting. Parcel inspected. No change. Conditions maintained. 75 years of monthly inspections. 900 entries. The same 6 words every time. No change. No change. No change. I went upstairs to my desk and opened the county's GIS system. I typed in the coordinates for parcel 1877R. The map loaded. The satellite imagery rendered in its usual slow cascade. Fields, tree lines, the thin gray thread of Old Furnace Road, winding through terrain that looked like every other piece of southeast Ohio, but where 1877R should have been, according to the coordinates in the file, there was nothing. Not an empty lot. Not an undeveloped parcel with grass and trees. A void. The map stopped rendering. The satellite imagery went blank. Not black, not white, but absent, as if that specific rectangle of Earth had never been photographed, as if every satellite that had ever passed overhead had looked away at precisely the right moment. The neighboring parcels were clearly delineated. Their boundaries existed. But the space between them, the space where 1877R should have been, was simply not there. I checked 2 other mapping services. Same result. The coordinates returned incomplete queries. The search would begin. The progress bar would advance to roughly 60%, then stall. After a minute, the page would refresh, as though the request had never been submitted. No error message. No location not found. Just a quiet, thorough erasure of the attempt. I sat at my desk with the afternoon light coming through the window and the ordinary sounds of the office around me, and I understood that I was looking at a piece of land that had been removed from the infrastructure of visibility itself. Not classified, not restricted, unmapped, a place that the county's systems and the wider digital world systems could not or would not render, as if the land itself refused to be seen. That night, I did not sleep well. I lay in my apartment and listened to the building settle around me. the creak of old joists, the whisper of air through gaps in the window frame. And I thought about Harold Ennis sitting at that same desk in 1953, writing his origin notes by the light of that same green lamp. I thought about Mrs. Pruitt's furniture, turned to face the walls by something that took the time to be careful. I thought about the man on Dullahan Pike, who heard his own voice from a sealed cellar and did not respond. And I thought about Old Furnace Road, about a piece of land the county had decided, 3/4 of a century ago, to simply hold, not study, not explain, not develop or sell, or even acknowledge on a map, just hold. The way you hold your breath when you hear a sound in a dark room, and you do not yet know what made it. I was in the basement office on a Wednesday afternoon in early January when the door opened behind me. I had grown careless. The routine of my visits had sanded away the edges of my caution, the way all routines do. I had the logbook open on the desk, and 3 folders spread in a semicircle, and I was taking notes on my legal pad, my handwriting getting smaller and faster the deeper I went, and the door opened and a man stepped through and stopped. He was older, late 60s, perhaps early 70s, with white hair cut short and close to the skull, and a face that carried the particular weathering of someone who has spent decades outdoors in all seasons. The skin around his eyes creased into permanent lines that deepened when he studied me. He wore a county ID badge on a lanyard, but I could not read the name from across the room. He looked at me. He looked at the logbook. He looked at the folders. His expression was not anger. It was something closer to resignation, the face of a person encountering a problem they had expected. "You're the new clerk too," he said. Not a question. I stood up. My chair scraped against the concrete floor, the sound jarringly loud in that sealed room. I started to explain. Something about the Tabernacle Road inquiry, the system flag, trying to locate the physical file. And he raised one hand, palm out, fingers slightly spread, and I stopped. "Sit down," he said. He closed the door. From behind the filing cabinet, he produced a folding chair I had never noticed, opened it across the desk from me, and sat. "How much have you read?" I told him. "Everything. The logbooks, the CRP files, the origin documents, Harold Ennis, the GS void where parcel 1877R should be." He listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the desk, his eyes on mine. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. The lamp hummed its faint electrical hum. The boiler rumbled somewhere behind the wall. Above us, the courthouse conducted its ordinary Wednesday business, and here, in a room that existed in no directory, a man I had never seen decided what to do with what I knew. "My name is Arthur Grieve," he said. "I am the current administrator of the lower division. I have held this position for 23 years. Before me, there was a woman named Patrice Sandoval, who served for 18. Before her, Harold Ennis, who served 27 years until his death in 1978. He let that settle. 3 administrators in 75 years, a succession so slow it felt geological. "I am going to tell you 3 things," he said. "First, everything you've read in these files is accurate. The conditions are real. The phenomena are real. The system works, not perfectly, not always, but it works. Compliance reduces the frequency and severity of incidents. Non-compliance does not. That is not theory. It is 75 years of data. Second, you were not supposed to find this room. Phil Oster found it before you. That is why Phil is on medical leave. He did not handle it well." He paused. "And third, you now have a choice." He explained the choice with the unhurried precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation, perhaps many times, for an eventuality he had always known would come. Option 1. I would sign a non-disclosure agreement that the county's legal department had maintained separately from all other legal documents since 1952. I would return to my desk. I would continue as a clerk tut with no further access to the basement office. The NDA would be binding for life. I would receive a modest salary increase. What he called a records adjustment and a notation would be placed in my personnel file that would follow me to any future government position, ensuring I was never assigned to archives, records management, or any role that might bring me near the lower division again. Option 2. I would sign a different NDA, more comprehensive, with what he described as a monitoring clause, involving periodic health assessments. I would begin training as the next administrator of the lower division. He was 69 years old. His health was good, he said, but not permanent. The program required continuity above all else. It had survived for 75 years because each administrator had identified and prepared a successor before they could no longer serve. He had been watching me, he said. Since the week I arrived, he had observed me notice the gap in the filing cabinets. He had noted when I began going to the basement. He had waited to see if I would find the door, and then the code, and then the logbook. And he had waited with the patience of a man whose entire career was built on patience, to see what I would do with what I read. Most people would have stopped at the door, he said. Phil stopped at the logbook and came apart. You went further, you took notes, you cross-referenced, you called a resident. That is not necessarily a virtue, but it is. I asked him about the handwriting, the same hand across 7 decades. He regarded me with an expression I can only describe as tired recognition. The look of a man who has carried an answer for a long time and finds no relief in giving it. Harold Ennis kept the logbook until 1978, he said. Patrice continued it. I continue it now. We were each trained in the same hand. It is part of the protocol. The logbook must be consistent. It must present as a single, unbroken record. That is what the lower division maintains above all else: continuity. The land does not change. The record must not appear to change. He stood, placed a manila envelope on the desk between us, and told me to take a week. Inside were the 2 NDAs, printed on the same heavy paper as the CRP documents, each bearing the county seal and a signature line at the bottom. He moved toward the door and paused with his hand on the frame. There is no option 3, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less precise. There is no version of this in which you walk away and simply forget. You've read the files. You know the addresses. You know the parcel numbers. That knowledge belongs to the county now, and the county will account for it one way or another. He left. The door closed. The lock engaged with its small, definitive sound. I sat in the lamplight with 2 documents in front of me, and the weight of a system I had never asked to discover pressing down like the limestone of the building itself. I took the week. I went to work each morning and processed permits and answered calls and ate my sandwich and went home and lay awake. I drove past Tabernacle Road one evening, slowing near the mailbox for 11:42, and saw a house that looked like any other rural property. White clapboard, a porch light on against the gathering dark, a truck in the driveway, a home. Nothing about it suggested that the people inside had lived for decades under conditions dictated by an agreement with something older than the county, something that turned furniture in the night with careful, purposeful hands that left no trace. On the 5th day, I drove out to Old Furnace Road. My phone's mapping application could not find the address, so I used the coordinates from the file written on a slip of paper taped to my dashboard. The road was unpaved past the first mile, gravel yielding to hard-packed dirt and then to something narrower, a path worn into the landscape through repetition rather than engineering. Trees pressed close on both sides, bare and gray in the November light, their branches interlocking overhead like the ribs of something long dead. I drove until the road ended at a rusted farm gate chained but not locked, the chain hanging loose as if it had been opened and closed many times. Beyond the gate, the land opened into a field that should have been unremarkable. Grass gone brown with the season, a few scattered trees, the gentle roll of southeast Ohio terrain, but it felt, and I want to be exact about this because exactness is all I have left. It felt like a room, not because of walls or fences or any visible boundary, because of a quality in the air itself, a pressure, a density, as if the sky above this particular piece of ground were lower and heavier than it should have been, pressing down with an attention that had nothing to do with weather. I did not cross the gate. I stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, my hands on the cold metal bar, and I watched. Nothing moved. The grass did not bend. The bare branches did not sway. There were no birds, no insects, no wind. The silence was not the absence of sound. It was a presence. Something that occupied the space where sound should have been. Something heavy and deliberate, the acoustic equivalent of a held breath. I stood at that gate, and I felt, with a certainty that I cannot prove and have never been able to dismiss, that the field was aware of me. Not watching with eyes, not conscious in any way I could diagram or define, but aware, attentive, with a patience so immense that my 10 minutes at its edge were to it less than the blink of a thing that does not blink. I drove home. I did not sleep. I sat in my kitchen chair with the lights off and watched the window slowly lighten, and I understood, with a clarity that felt less like revelation than surrender, that I was not going to sign either document. I resigned from the Hargrove County Office of Land Use and Development on the first Friday of February. I typed a brief letter, printed it, signed it, and delivered it to my supervisor, who accepted it with the mild annoyance of a manager, who would now need to post a listing. Donna watched me clean out my desk. She did not ask why I was leaving. She did not wish me well. As I placed the last of my things in a cardboard box, the tan mug, a few pens, a sweater I kept on the back of my chair, she said, very quietly, without looking up from her screen, "You were always too curious for this office." I did not go back to the basement. On my last day, I found an envelope in my apartment mailbox. No return address, no postmark. It had been placed by hand. Inside was a single sheet of the heavy paper I now recognize the way you recognize a face, with 3 lines of text. "Your resignation has been noted. Non-disclosure obligations remain in effect under County Charter Provision 11C, applicable to all employees who have accessed restricted records during their tenure. The lower division thanks you for your discretion." No signature, only the county seal embossed and below it, in small type, Office 002. I left Breslin the following week. I moved back north, closer to family, and took a job in the private sector that has nothing to do with permits or land use or government of any kind. I have not returned, but I think about it. Every day, in the small hours, in the quiet moments between tasks, in the space. Just before sleep, when the mind loosens its grip on the orderly and allows the other things in. I think about it. I think about Donna Adwell, sitting at her desk year after year, advancing the date on her calendar, answering the phone, knowing what the basement contained and choosing. Every single day, the ordinary over the incomprehensible. I think about Gerald Mathers on Dullahan Pike, lying awake at 3 in the morning, in a house where every reflective surface has been made small, enough to be harmless, listening for knocking, keeping his feet off the ground floor, recording each incident in a journal he mails to a county office 4 times a year. A man whose entire domestic life has been shaped by a quarterly form. I think about Mrs. Pruitt, who has not spent a single night in her own home between November and February for 37 years, because a man from the county sat at her kitchen table and told her that her compliance was the protection, and because her living room furniture had already proven him right in ways no words could match. I think about Old Furnace Road, about a field that no satellite photographs, about a piece of land that the county decided 75 years ago to simply hold, not examine, not explain, not acknowledge on any map, just hold, the way you hold pressure on a wound that you know with absolute certainty will never close. And I think about Harold Ennis, about a man who sat at a desk in a basement room in 1953 and pulled the chain on a green lamp and opened a new logbook to the first blank page and began to write. Not because he understood what he was documenting, not because writing would stop it or slow it or change its nature in any way, but because documentation was the only gesture available to a man inside a system that had already decided its response. Not to fight, not to flee, not to explain, but to administer, to file, to maintain conditions, to renew the permit and advance the date stamp, and write the same 6 words, no, change, conditions maintained, and close the book and turn off the lamp, and climb the stairs back into a world that believes its records are complete. I am telling you this because I signed neither document, and I am telling you this because the provision they cited, County Charter 11C, does not exist. I checked. I hired a lawyer and had her check. There is no provision 11C in the Hargrove County Charter. There never has been. The county sent me a non-disclosure obligation that references a law that is not real, printed on paper, that matches documents from a division that is not public, sealed with an embossment from an office that does not appear on any directory, in any building, in any county in this state. They used the structure of authority without the substance of it. And they expected me to comply, because the structure has always been enough. For most people, it is. That is the horror. Not the knocking at Gerald Mathers's door, not the furniture turned to face the walls, not the field on Old Furnace Road that swallows sound and watches without eyes. The horror is that it works. The horror is that people receive conditions they cannot explain, printed on official paper with an official seal, and they comply. Not because they trust the government, not because they believe in the county, but because the alternative is to live without the only framework that has ever acknowledged what they already know. Something is there. Something has always been there. And the county, with its forms and its renewals and its quarterly reports, is the only institution that has ever said, yes, we know, here are the rules. Take the rules away, and what is left? Just the land. Just the silence that slips through sealed doors and rearranges the familiar and speaks in your own voice from rooms you cannot reach. Just the agreement, unsatiate, unspoken, older than any charter, that has existed since before there was a county to administer it. I do not know what inhabits those 31 parcels. I do not know what the lower division truly understands about it, or whether understanding is even the right word. I do not know whether the conditions actually protect anyone, or merely provide the architecture of protection, the comfort of a form in the face of the formless. I have turned these questions over for months, the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight and its edges, never finding a seam. And the closest I have come to an answer is this: It may not matter. The county decided long ago that management is enough. That containment through compliance is the best available outcome, that the land will do what it does, and the paperwork will continue. And the people who live within the boundaries of those 31 parcels will wake each morning and check their conditions and file their reports and seal their cellars and avoid their ground floors and never, ever answer the knocking, and that this is what it means to live in Hargrove County, whether you know it or not. And the rest of us, the ones who live on parcels without conditions, who file for fence, permits, and deck additions, and think we understand what a county government does. We go on believing that the records are complete, that the map shows everything, that every office in the courthouse has a name on the directory, and every division has a page on the website, and every rule exists because a board voted and a clerk recorded, and a system processed it into the clean, searchable order of public record. I believe that once I sat at a desk on the second floor of a limestone building and drank slightly too strong coffee from a tan mug and thought the worst part of government work was the boredom. I don't believe that anymore. If you own property, go to your county's records office. Pull your permit history. Read every line, not just the summary, not just the status, but every clause, every condition, every marginal note. And if you find something you don't understand, a restriction that maps to no building code, a condition that seems to govern not what you build, but how you live, do not dismiss it. Do not assume it is a clerical artifact, an outdated regulation someone forgot to remove, a system error that means nothing. Ask yourself what your county knows about your land, that it has decided you do not need to understand. Ask yourself what agreement you are maintaining without knowing its terms. And then, on some quiet night when the house has settled and the dark is its own room kind of room and you are alone with nothing but the sound of your own breathing, listen. Listen to the walls around you. Listen to the floors beneath your feet. Listen to the cellar door, if you have one, and ask yourself, honestly, in the privacy of that silence, is it keeping something out or is it keeping something in? The lower division is still operating. The logbook is still being written, in the same careful hand, under the same green lamp, in a basement room that no directory has ever listed and no map has ever shown. The 31 properties are still occupied. The conditions are still maintained. And somewhere beneath a limestone courthouse, in a town you have never heard of, a date stamp is being advanced by one day, every morning, by a person whose name you will never learn, in service of a system that was built not to protect you from the truth, but to make the truth administrative, manageable, filed, because that is what government does in the end. It does not conquer what it cannot explain. It files it, it stamps it, it files it again, and the land does not care who files the paperwork. But the paperwork is all we have.